people have special needs on that. Please just feel free to fill in this spot here. Our speaker will speak from this point approximately, and we'll be videotaping this, so if you don't get it, we'll sell you the videotape for $10. I'm pleased to first introduce our president. Mario Aste. Mario will do the honors for our featured speaker. And incidentally, our featured speaker is the lead editor of the proceedings for this conference, and he will tell you a little bit about, in prefacing his remarks, he'll tell you a little bit about how you can get your presentation published in our projected proceedings, Italian Americans in World War II. President Mario Aste. Gary Mormino.
When I come from Sardinia, and the person who wears the pants is who wears the pants in Sardinia? The man. But the boss is the one who does not wear the pants. It is the woman. So that's why I had to ask the executive director who is doing the talk. Who is the boss? You going to talk to us?
Yes.
And,
We ready?
yes, make it nice and short.
I have 2 words for everyone. Food fight! Okay. This is a challenge, but stay with me. I'd like to begin on a somber note that the spirit of George Pozzetta hangs heavily over this conference, that in a more perfect world, George Pozzetta, not I, would be giving this speech, and doubtlessly there would be special panels debating the merits of George's book, Epics of War, but I have inherited the task of finishing his book, so bear with me, it is coming along. On a very personal level, World War II has always intrigued me. Besides Banquo's ghost, the spirits of World War II still linger, and I've often tried to figure out professionally and personally the meaning of the war to me and my family. My father was 20 years old when the war broke out. He had been a grade school dropout, had been trying to get a job in the industries, in the factories across the river from St. Louis, Missouri. And he joined the construction battalion, the Seabees, because he thought that when he came back after the war, he could get a job operating heavy machinery. It was quite true. He had just fallen in love with Mabel Dingle, who had a new stepfather, by the way, Stasi. But my mother had come from southern Illinois, from an impoverished coal mining town, where her father had died, and they had fallen in love before the war began. My father returns after encountering these strange and exotic places, Okinawa, Bougainville, New Caledonia. My parents are married in January 1946. 12 months later, I'm part of this new vanguard, the baby boom. So, World War II appeals to me at that level, but as a even more famous Italian-American war veteran, Michael Corleone once said, "It's not personal, Sonny, it's professional." And professionally, the meaning of the war has also intrigued me. Anyone who studies American history must grapple with the complexities and the importance of World War II. Both for the United States and Italian-American history, it was the great watershed. And I think it's the decade of the 1940s represents the most important decade since migration and immigration. To observe Little Italy from the vantage point of 1940 on the eve of the war is still to find an Italian America vibrant in its ethnic colonies, dozens and dozens of Italian language papers. Most of the original Italian American colonies are still there. Now, change has come. I mean, this is an important point of exactly what is the role of World War II. And in some ways, I'd like to borrow two metaphors today. One is World War II acted like a superconductor. It heated up everything, it sped up everything, and forced change. Even though the decades prior to World War II, there had been out-migration, there had been assimilation, there had been Americanization. The other metaphor I'd like to borrow from Rudolf Eppley, the metaphor of the centrifuge. World War II acted like this incredible centrifuge, taking millions of Italian Americans from the colony and throwing them, speeding them out to refineries, factories, military bases, and battlefields across the world, and trying to figure out that. I think two days bracket Italian American history. December the 7th, 1941, and August the 14th, 1945. They represent the beginning and the end of World War II, but also the beginning of the end, in many ways, for so many Italian American colonies. You can never quite put them back together after the tumult of the war. When Johnny and Joey, Rosie and Carolyn come back from the war, it's not the same Italian American colony. It never has been in war. Ever since Homer described Odysseus coming back, the home front has changed. And so it was in 1945. Again, the metaphors of the superconductor and the centrifuge. Consider the following facts about World War II and where Italian Americans fit in. Not since the high water marks of 1907 and 1914 had so many people, had so many Italian Americans been on the move worldwide. During World War II, 15 million men and 300,000 women, 1 in 9 Americans left home for training camps. More than 3/4 of them went overseas. Another 15 million persons, 1 in 8 civilians, changed their county of residence during the war. By war's end, 1 in 5 Americans had been swept up in the Great Wartime Migration. And certainly hundreds of thousands, if not millions of those, were Italian Americans. Swept into the maelstrom of war, young Italian Americans enlisted in the military. By the way, we do not have, and probably never will know, how many Italian Americans entered the service. You see the figure all the time, 1 million. It's a guess. The Army and the military did not want to keep figures. This was not the Civil War where you have the Irish Brigade fighting. This is a war for democracy. Race still mattered, but not ethnicity in World War II when recruiting an army. When Johnny and Sal marched off the war, they marched off with their neighbors, but they did not fight with their neighbors because of politics. This is a different war in that sense. And nothing illustrates, I think, the power of World War II more than the platoon. I've interviewed many Italian Americans, and many would argue the most meaningful experience in their lives, the greatest accomplishment in their lives, the most intense friendships in their lives occurred when meeting other friends in World War II, not necessarily Italian Americans. The movie version of the platoon is not entirely inaccurate. You did have Jews from the Bronx, Italians from Brooklyn, always a kid from the South named Alabama, the intellectual from the West. The platoon was more reality than myth in that sense. The war exposed even greater number of Italian American men and women to new work experiences. Who wants to work at Zito's Bakery when you can work at Grumman's Aircraft and make more in a week than you could in a month in the old neighborhood. Travel and work open new doors, new relationships, new economies, new social worlds beckon. Again, fully 15 million civilians took new jobs in World War II, half of them moving to new states. Tens of thousands of veterans, of war veterans, serving the Atlantic theater, experienced an incredible sensation when they marched back, both as conquerors and paisani, to their parents' villages of origin. There's a great book there for someone, by the way. There's just countless accounts of what happens when the second generation Italian American goes back to Alia in Sicily or Campobello in Catania and meets the relatives. First of all, not many of them even understand the dialect. The Iveti understand the dialect. But it's a remarkable experience of bonding and reunion. Great book there for someone. Others encountered places even stranger than Palermo, Alabama, and Naples, Italy. That is Naples, Florida, and Palermo, Alabama. I meant Palermo, Sicily. But you know where I was going with this. That is, hundreds of thousands of Italian Americans went to the West and the South during World War II, where they encountered something that looked like polenta, but sounding like grits. They encountered Southern bells. They also encountered Jim Crow. For California, World War II was the great watershed. Aircraft, factories, new bases, virtually every veteran going to the Pacific Theater traveled through. And fast forward, by the way, to fast forward 60 years. I just looked at the results of the 2000 census. California, with 100,000 immigrants in 1940, today has 1 million Italian Americans. Florida, with 10,000 Italian immigrants in 1940, has 1 million Italian Americans today. Sal Lagumina is typical of that new order of Italian American retirees who set two counties in Florida, Broward and Palm Beach. They of the computer glitches and pregnant chads. They have combined 300,000 Italian Americans. Whereas New York City in the last decade lost 30% of its Italian American population. This is not all because of World War II, but many veterans saw Florida and California and the orange trees, 70 degrees in March, and they must have said, someday I'm coming back. And there's a great story there, again, for someone. What happens to ethnicity when you retire in Florida and you bring your Sons of Italy chapter with you? It's a great story. In 1945, however, veterans were not concerned with sunlit retirement. There were three great concerns of all returning veterans: work, family, and neighborhood. Work, family, and neighborhood. Actually, housing, family, and work, same thing. They defined kind of the trinity of 1940s concerns. And all three intersected and impacted the neighborhood. Veterans almost universally had difficulty obtaining housing in 1945. Most veterans lived with their parents in 1940. They didn't want to live with their parents in 1945, especially if they were married and engaged. And thus comes one of the most visionary government programs, the GI Bill. But the devil was in the details. Interestingly, the GI Bill helped finance your new home in the suburbs. It did not help finance your tenement in the Bronx or North Beach. Thus, in some ways, the government paved the way for suburbia after the war. And this is very injurious to ethnic objects. The other book I would suggest someone write out there, a book on the impact of the federal government on ethnic America, 40s, 50s, 60s. What happens to North Beach? What happens to the Italian colony in Illinois Circle? The Hill in St. Louis, Ybor City in Florida. That same government with the power to finance and fight a war can also embark on urban renewal. And Italian colonies, often in the center of the city, pay heavily for this price. The steadfast and embattled ethnic neighborhood that we study so much, North Beach, Ybor City, the Hill, West Side, North End of Boston, prepared for a new crisis after World War II. And the point is, most Italian Americans were beginning to move from the old neighborhoods to the new. The media in Hollywood even has this today. The Corleones moved to Lake Tahoe, and the Sopranos added to the Jersey Sprawl. This is part of a great process. Everywhere it seemed Little Italy struggled in post-war America. The largest Italian colony in the United States, East Harlem, was deteriorating badly. Its housing already substandard. New veterans did not want to live there. And in fact, a new immigrant group was moving in, Puerto Ricans, during the war. In fact, soon Italian Harlem would become Spanish Harlem. North Beach in 1940 commanded 25% of San Francisco's Italian community. By 1970, it was 10%. Chinese were encroaching upon North Beach. Almost everywhere in the Midwest and Northeast, African Americans, for the same reason Italian Americans had left, moved in search of jobs and housing. These are great post-war themes I think we're just beginning to explore. Ethnic relations in that post-war environment. Individuals move, but institutions stay. The Catholic Church. The church operated overtime in the 1940s. Interesting statistic, in 1946, 2.3 million American couples married, a record. Interestingly, by the way, 60 years later, 1 in 5 couples, or 1 in 5 marriages are still intact. Wedding bells must have reassured old-timers, but the bells tolled an ominous note. For the first time in Italian-American history, especially Italian males were marrying non-Italian females. This is very dangerous. Lawyers tell you should never do this. But let's have a poll in here. If you are an Italian-American veteran of World War II, or if you had an Italian-American father who was a veteran of World War II, raise your hand. How many of you married, how many of your parents or you married Italians? Interesting. Half. Certainly in 1920, it would have been almost universal. That's true. Before the war, Italian men met Italian women in church, at the social club, at school. Increasingly, you now met your bride at a USO club or an aircraft factory. This was much more so for males than females, by the way. Thus, it's interesting. What I'm suggesting then is there's a profoundly new type of ethnicity at the war. If the twin pillars of Italian Americana were family and neighborhood, and if you married a non-Italian and you no longer live in the ethnic community, something has changed. I'm not suggesting that Italian-American males imitated Ozzie Nelson and went to the mall shop and put on a gray flannel suit, but it is a new type of ethnicity. What being Italian-American meant after the war was something very different before the war. And I think it's fantastic opportunities for young scholars to study this. Just when I was in grad school 30 years ago, everyone was studying the Great Migration. I think now the great opportunity will be the 1940s and 1950s. How are we doing time-wise?
We've got about 10 minutes anyway.
Okay. I think in summary, the war pushed and pulled Italians to the mainstream. Not into the mainstream, but toward the mainstream. Again, think of if someone had told you in 1940 on the eve of World War II, I have a prediction. I predict that hundreds of thousands of you young Italian Americans World Association before the war, Americans had reasons to cheer Italians after the war. The post-war years introduced or reintroduced the public to a succession of Italian-American entertainers and heroes. Frank Sinatra, Perry Como, Frankie Lane, Vic Damone, Louis Prima, Dean Martin, Vincent Minnelli, Ernest Borgnine. Sports fans cheered the exploits of Rockies, Graziano, Marciano, Colavito, Tutan, Tony Galinza, Jake LaMotta, Joe DiMaggio, Yogi Bear, Carl Furillo, Johnny Antonelli, Dolph Camilli, Sal Mangley, Vic Rashi. What that means, and I understand you don't have to love Italian Americans to cheer Joe DiMaggio, but I think it meant something. The Italian restaurant and pizza parlor certainly leave the ethnic colony, move toward the city. Within an oregano smell of this building, in 1943, Ike Sewell introduced deep dish pizza, Pizzeria Uno, in Chicago in 1943. There will be a pilgrimage. Most dramatically, and this is the point, most dramatically, Italian Americans shared in the prosperity after the war. For decades, millions of Italian Americans had lived in grinding poverty and an economy of scarcity. What did it mean then in the 1940s and 1950s when their children coped with new challenges, abundance and an economy of prosperity? Luxury, a Roman poet once warned, is more dangerous than war. For the first time in their collective lives, Italian Americans optimistically believed that they could share in some of the middle-class comforts. Yes, Italian Americans own homes. Now they could own better homes. They could reasonably be assured that their children wouldn't have to leave school to help the Italian family economy. Middle-class comforts beckon. And it did not necessarily mean that it washed their ethnic identity. I think this is something we have to study. Consider the following statistics. American workers saw their average annual earnings rise from $750 in 1940 to $1,300 in 1944. Union membership rose from 6 million in 1934 to 15 million in 1945. A third of the non-agricultural labor force. During the Great Depression, 1/3 of all Americans, most Italian Americans, lived below the poverty line. By 1945, just 1/3 of Americans were poor. I think post-war America was a good time and a good place to be young and Italian American. With only 7% of the world's population, we produce 50% of the world's manufacturing goods. You could reasonably expect, even if uneducated, to get a factory job, a good factory job, and support your family and own a home. This was before the 60s and deindustrialization and downsizing. There is, I think, that period, 1945-1960, is an interesting period to examine with more intensity what it meant to be Italian American. Of course, the GI Bill. It's my opinion right now, and I've got more work to do, is that relatively few Italian Americans took advantage of the GI educational bill. Those that did were more likely to attend Brooklyn College than Vassar or Loyola than University of Illinois. But compared to the pre-war numbers, those were influential figures who did take advantage of the GI Bill. I think far more influential than the college GI Bill was the vocational bill. You can also use your GI Bill to go to bakery school or learn the plumbing trade. In fact, many Italian Americans used their wartime experiences as an MP to get a job as a policeman after the war. The war and the post-war prosperity lift an extraordinary number of Americans out of poverty. And we think of studying Italian Americans before the war was grappling with poverty and strikes, and it's a very different experience after the war. I've got one more. World War II was a critical force in shaping veterans and civilians' identities as Americans, as well as what it meant to be Italian American. The war drained ethnic neighborhoods, and when Sal and Vito, Connie and Maria returned 4 years later, they discovered profound changes in their communities. For the first times in their lives, large numbers of young men and women were gone. The children of immigrants had crossed oceans and continents, learned new skills, and met new associates. Everywhere the war brought dislocation and stress, movement and disruption. Much of the literature of the war tends to point a picture that the war was the engine for social change, massive amounts of Americanization. I think you could still be Italian American and have lived through that period. A new Italian America emerges from the war. More American, but also more understanding of the meaning of being Italian. Immigration had forced upon their parents to redefine themselves and what it meant to be a Milanese or a Napolitano in Chicago or San Francisco. Their sons and daughters now had to redefine themselves on what it meant to be Italian American. Thank you very much. Don't forget the cannolis, as someone once said. Questions. Do we have time for questions?
Okay.
Yes.
If the war brought on such a assimilation of the Italian American into America, how do you explain the popularity of the so-called Italians, Sopranos?
Well, again, I'm really focused on the 1940s and 1950s. I think the great event that changed our lives here was the late 1960s and the ethnic revival. I mean, in fact, if anything, I think that the 50s, the civil rights movement, the increasing frustration of Italian Americans over Vietnam, that creates a new ethnic revival, symbolic if you want, but again, the Sopranos debate is an interesting one. I'm not sure I want to get into it here. Yes, Dominic.
Yeah, Gary, I remember that my aunts and uncles after the war, maybe during the war, weren't particularly proud of being Italian because Italy was the enemy. And then in the media post-war period, Italy was war-torn. In fact, as I mentioned to you previously, we were sending packages that had pasta in it to Italy, to our relatives in Italy. We were sending our old clothes to them. Well, what the hell kind of country could that be if they needed our pasta and our old clothes? So we weren't really proud of Italy at that point.
That's an interesting question, and I touched on it briefly, but certainly the stigmata of Mussolini must have humiliated many young Italian Americans. And yet, at the same time, you have this reawakening during the war of many veterans. You have the experience in 1948, the State Department actively campaigning in many Italian communities, urging people to write relatives to vote for the Christian Democrat Party as Italy was teetering there. It's certainly, it's a great study for someone to do. At the same time, you have the new post-war films coming out, new stars. I mean, it's very complicated. I really haven't grappled specifically with that yet, but there's a lot of loose ends going on there. And I suspect some Italian Americans closed the door to their relatives in Italy. You know, Mussolini humiliated me. Others reconnected during the war. I think it would have been interesting for the San Francisco crowd if someone were doing interviews in the 50s of the people who had been evacuated. I could see them answering the question two ways. One, I think they might answer, it was still worth the price. This is the greatest country in the world, and if it meant being evacuated, I was glad to do it. Others angry and you wouldn't cooperate. Did anyone interview people during the war or right after the war? And certainly, the people you interviewed, their memory of war is an interesting subject. It's filtered through the civil rights movement, the Japanese-American reparations debate.
I think there are, people are in two or more minds about it. On the one hand, there's sort of a underlying pride that we got through this, didn't hurt us. On the other hand, I've heard people say after the war, our neighborhoods were ruined or didn't exist anymore. We didn't have parades anymore. So there's a sense, and it's my sense too, that while Italian Americans obviously did do better economically, there's also a sense that somehow we lost something that had value. And what that something was is not always easy to articulate by most of these people. But, we called everybody in the neighborhood CEO. We don't do that anymore.
And the point I was trying to make is, certainly the Italian-American community in 1920 was not the same as it was there had been change ever since the beginning. The war, though, superheats and accelerates everything. I think more change took place in those 4 years than probably 2 decades could have afterwards. Mary Jo.
Can you talk a little bit more about the role of Italian-American women during the World War II period and after the way in which they took over certain roles in the workforce?
Right. There's a great deal of concern on the home front that Johnny will be all right in the military. He's streets, but they're really concerned about the women who stayed behind. That everything seems. You have to also realize on the eve. There's something fascinating, by the way. Today we salute the greatest generation. In 1940, if you look at the literature, Americans are greatly concerned about that greatest generation. The words used again in juvenile delinquents, gangs. They don't respect their parents. They don't, and thus there's a great amount of concern. At least we've got to keep the women holding the faith. And you'll find stories of the women no longer ask us about dating. In the old days, they'd ask for a chaperone, and now they've met an American at work, or she no longer turns over her paycheck to us. And yet, on the other hand, certainly Italian-American women are much more likely to marry an Italian-American. There is a paradox. Certainly, many will take, as you know, it's a myth that women worked for the first time in World War II. What happened in World War II, married middle-class white workers. And I have found, one thing I have found is that I have not found many Italian-American women in the military services. First of all, they tended to favor college-educated women, and that would be Italian-Americans in 1940. But I sense also have domineering fathers who wouldn't have been crazy. And if you read the literature, the women, there's an assault upon one's sexuality, the women who enter the WWII waves and groups like that. So if they're there, I have not found them. But that's a great topic, though, for people to explore in more depth. Women on the home front and women move to take new jobs.
Actually, that's what I'll be talking about tomorrow. I looked at the Italian newspapers in Connecticut, and there's a tremendous sense of pride in the Italian-American women who have joined WWII, who have joined the Navy.
You think there's a considerable number?
I don't know.
Okay. Can you hear her? No. She's your name, please. Annette Pontillo is going to be in a paper tomorrow, and she said she explored Connecticut newspapers, and that the women who did join the WWII and waves, there was a great deal of pride. Italian-American women? Italian-American women. She's not prepared to say considerable number, but so it's great that people are studying.
I was going to the wave of immigration. I don't know if you limit yourself to a certain area in the 60s, which they are not the traditional immigrants professionals with degrees and so on, which became in the state lured by the United States, mostly to teach foreign languages, to teach in universities and so on. So, and we came here with the understanding we'll do a couple of years, then go back. I'm still here. But some people didn't go back. But some of the major professors, institutions of higher learning, are from Italy, and they came here in the middle 60s. Fido, for example, Brown, Stanford, and several other, I cannot list the list of names, Crisafulli and so on, which they were professors and or engineers, doctors, and that's a new wave of immigrants that we have to study. And they came over here, and they're still here.
It'd be an interesting study of the immigrants of the 1930s, Sal Femini and Fermi and people like that, to that of the 60s. I haven't studied
those of they came because they ran away from fascism. In the 60s, they came because the United States needed their knowledge and needed their stuff, and then with the intention of go back, but we're still here.
Of course, that's a topic I did not explore, but the anti-fascists, pro-fascists, and certainly the more conservative element will triumph in this. Precisely at the moment, the anti-fascists might take advantage of the war and their service during the war. McCarthyism reigns its head in 1950. So,
those of us are Michael's impression.
Off the watch.
I agree with you, Marco. I'm one of them.
We want to
In other words, was not running away from fascism or anything.
Right.
We came because we wanted to come. And the great majority of us who had degrees came from families who were educated. Well, at the beginning was very hard. We probably, to a certain degree, carried the dream of returning, but we never returned to it. We were still here and we intend to stay here. So I think it's a very interesting group to start.
how we doing on
Oh, one or two more questions. That's it.
Harry, being a high school graduate, I don't mind admitting 1944, during the war period, about 20 to 25 of the female graduates which had were Italian American, their support in the war effort. Whether that was unusual or not, I don't know.
And by the way, in spite of the power of Rosie the Riveter, most women who worked during World War II worked as secretaries, clerks, bookkeepers. And I suspect that was an avenue of many young Italian American females moving up in that area. Time for one, please.
Gary, I wondered if any research, thank you. I wondered if any research had been done on Italian American women in terms of work or marrying out because of the death of so many young men.
Yeah,
Some of them were Italian American in World War II. Did their, being single, did they become role models?
That would be,
for
did you
women?
hear a question?
Did they marry out?
Yeah. That would be, I don't know. I would say, though, it's interesting what has happened when I began as a graduate student in 1969 with George Pizzetta at the University of North Carolina. Then the great desire that I wanted to see was kind of a new WPA interview of the Italian immigrants. So let's face it, almost all the immigrants who came before 1920 are dead. Now the great challenge, I think, for local historical societies would be to interview that World War II generation. This was a generation that wrote letters, and the interviews around those questions. It'd be an interesting project would be to develop a national questionnaire. And of course, there are local concerns. In Pittsburgh, you'd want to know about the steel companies, and in Brooklyn, you'd want to know about work at the naval yards. But I think that's one of the great archival challenges today would be to interview 1,000 World War II veterans die every day in America. 1,000 every day. And I'm gratified. Is Mr. Grenay here? Probably these wonderful books, if you're not. These wonderful books about their wartime experiences.
Well, thank you very much, Gary.
Before we break up, would you please announce how presenters can get their stuff and proceedings?
Send me your paper, 3 copies of your paper and disc. We've got some flyers down there, and Paul Giordano and Professor Nardini are also co-editing this book. We'll try to speed it along in the long and noble tradition of AHOP publications.
I've got a question there.
That's sarcasm.
So you want to do that?
No, 3 copies of the hardback book.
Okay,